results without being prepared to explain more concretely than you have the limits of your own argument. I mean, I could go down the list with you of the cabinet officers and ask you whether you think they could be headed by a multi-member commission whose members are not subject to at-will removal by the president. Shall we do that? How about Veterans Affairs? How about Interior? Labor, EPA, Commerce, Education, what am I missing?
Agriculture.
Agriculture.
Mr. Agrawal, are you prepared?
Well, there was a question there.
Yes, so I don't want to pretend to greater certainty than I have about the full gamut of statutory authorities vested in all those other departments. I will say that based on a very quick preliminary analysis, it appeared to us that the vast majority of executive departments wield at least some.
You just watched Samuel Alito rehearse the death of democracy itself, and he had the gall to make it sound like a goddamned academic parlor game, listing off federal agencies like he was running through his grocery list, while casually contemplating whether the President of the United States should be able to personally control every single mechanism of government accountability. And if your blood isn't already at a rolling boil, then you haven't been paying attention, because this Supreme Court majority appears poised to completely overrule the 1935 Humphreys Executor views United States precedent, literally yesterday during oral arguments in Trump v. Slaughter. And what that means is nothing short of the architectural demolition of the administrative state as we know it, the final capitulation to an authoritarian vision of presidential power that would make the founders weep if they could see what these robed reactionaries are preparing to unleash upon the Republic. Listen to Alito's smug little inquisition there, this affected casualness as he runs through Veterans Affairs and Interior and Labor and the EPA and Commerce and Education and Agriculture, asking whether all of these could be headed by a multi-member commission whose members are not subject to at-will removal by the president, as though he's genuinely curious rather than laying the rhetorical groundwork for the most catastrophic expansion of executive power in modern American history. And you heard that attorney stammering about preliminary analysis and conclusive and preclusive authorities because he knows exactly what's happening here. He knows that Samuel Alito and other conservative justices helped develop the unitary executive theory during the Reagan administration. This isn't some neutral judicial inquiry. This is the culmination of a 40-year project to concentrate power in the presidency and strip Congress of its ability to create independent agencies that can resist the whims of whoever happens to occupy the Oval Office at any given moment. The bombshell you need to understand, the absolutely staggering reality that progressive legal scholars have been screaming about for months, is that the conservative majority has invited this aggressive approach to executive power with its 2024 decision protecting Trump from criminal prosecution, and has been laying groundwork for reversing the 1935 precedent that protects federal trade commissioners and others removed by Trump before the end of their terms, which means we are witnessing in real time the Supreme Court constructing a constitutional architecture for autocracy, and Alito's little Socratic dialogue in that clip is him testing the boundaries of just how far they can go, how much of the federal government they can hand over to presidential control, without the American people rising up in sufficient numbers to stop them. Because make no mistake, what we're talking about here is the systematic dismantling of expert-led agencies that protect workers and veterans, the environment and consumers in favor of a government where every single official serves at the pleasure of one man and can be fired the moment they displease him politically. Rebecca Slaughter received an email from Trump in March saying her continued service on the FTC is inconsistent with my administration's priorities, and she's now been kept out of her position after the Supreme Court allowed her firing in September by a 6-3 vote along ideological lines. And this is the commissioner Trump himself originally appointed in 2018, which reveals the terrifying truth that this isn't even about competence or qualifications or malfeasance, it's purely about ideological conformity, about ensuring that every person in a position to make decisions that affect corporate power or environmental protection or labor rights or consumer safety is personally loyal to the president's political agenda rather than to the statutory mission Congress assigned them, and Justice Elena Kagan tried to warn everyone during arguments, pointing out that once you use a particular kind of argument to justify one thing, you can't turn your back on that kind of argument if it also justifies another thing in the exact same way, essentially screaming that putting a footnote in an opinion saying we don't decide X, Y, and Z because it's not before us doesn't do much good if the entire logic of the opinion drives you there, but the conservative justices don't care because this is where they want to go. Here's what absolutely nobody in the mainstream media is adequately explaining to the American people, and it's making me want to tear my hair out, because the implications are so staggering and so immediate. The 1935 Humphreys executor decision allowed Congress to establish specialized agencies, led by experts shielded from presidential pressure, as they prevent fraudulent business practices, safeguard employee rights, or protect consumers, which means 90 years of regulatory infrastructure protecting ordinary Americans from corporate predation and environmental destruction and workplace exploitation suddenly hangs by a thread, and Trump's lawyer John Sauer drew heavily on the court's 2024 Trump v. United States immunity decision, which enhanced the conception of the president's conclusive and preclusive power, and Trump himself has been emphatic that he regards Humphrey's executor as wrongly decided and believes he has power to fire anyone in the executive branch. So we're not talking about some abstract legal theory here. We're talking about an administration that has already demonstrated its authoritarian instincts and a Supreme Court majority that appears ready to give constitutional blessing to those instincts by vaporizing a unanimous 1935 precedent that has protected the independence of federal agencies for nearly a century. And the most infuriating part, the element that should have every progressive organizer and every union leader and every environmental advocate and every civil rights attorney mobilizing right this second, is that President Trump is waging a campaign to dismantle the U.S. administrative state by fundamentally altering the structure and function of federal agencies, with his second-term agenda going far beyond regulatory rollbacks into wholesale remaking of the federal government in ways that circumvent Congress and expand presidential power in unprecedented and potentially unconstitutional ways. Like, we have the receipts, we have the documentation. We know that Trump has implemented or is in the process of implementing about half of Project 2025's proposals, and the Heritage Foundation said the Trump administration embraced nearly 64% of the 2016 edition's policy solutions after 1 year. So anyone still pretending this is normal partisan politics rather than a coordinated assault on democratic governance itself is either lying or catastrophically uninformed. The truly chilling dimension that should keep you up at night is how this connects to everything else Trump is doing to consolidate power, because Trump vowed to re-sign an executive order known as Schedule F, which could reclassify tens of thousands of civil servants into at-will political appointments, who Trump could fire and replace with loyalists, and he's assigned billionaire Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to run the Department of Government Efficiency to explore ways to slash the federal budget, which means the plan is horrifyingly comprehensive. First, you use Schedule F to purge career civil servants who might resist based on professional expertise or institutional knowledge. Then you use the Supreme Court's blessing in Trump v. Slaughter to eliminate the independence of multi-member commissions, and suddenly you have a federal government staffed entirely by people who owe their jobs to personal loyalty to Donald Trump rather than to the American people, or to statutory law, or to any conception of the public interest beyond what serves Trump's political objectives. And progressive scholars of authoritarianism have been absolutely explicit that this is textbook executive aggrandizement. This is the playbook that Orban used in Hungary and Erdogan used in Turkey, and every other elected autocrat has used to transform democracy into competitive authoritarianism. Education Secretary Linda McMahon declared, "The Trump administration is taking bold action to break up the federal education bureaucracy and return education to the states." And Senator Patty Murray responded that this is an outright illegal effort to continue dismantling the Department of Education, and it is students and families who will suffer the consequences, and this is happening right now, not in some dystopian future. The Trump administration announced it will transfer much of the U.S. Department of Education's programs to other agencies, including the Department of Labor and State Department, with new agreements signed to begin managing programs currently under the Education Department, and the legal authority for this is dubious at best. Opponents say given that Congress created these offices and explicitly located them inside the Education Department, the White House cannot legally move their work without Congress's approval. But they're doing it anyway because they're testing how much they can get away with. They're probing the limits of what courts and Congress and the American people will tolerate, and every time they get away with something unconstitutional, it emboldens them to go further. The intellectual genealogy of this nightmare is crucial to understand, because it reveals this isn't some spontaneous Trumpian chaos. This is the fruit of decades of conservative legal movement organizing. Young lawyers, including John Roberts and Samuel Alito, worked in the Reagan administration, developing the unitary executive theory, and during Alito's confirmation hearings for the Supreme Court in January 2006, several witnesses testified against him based on his embrace of the unitary executive theory and how that would undermine checks and balances, which means we were warned. The alarm bells were ringing 18 years ago, and Democrats in the Senate confirmed him anyway, and now we're living with the consequences as Chief Justice John Roberts called Humphrey's executor just a dried husk of whatever people used to think it was, essentially announcing that the court is prepared to throw 90 years of precedent in the trash because it interferes with their ideological project of constructing an imperial presidency. What Alito is doing in that clip when he lists Veterans Affairs and Interior and Labor and EPA and Commerce and Education and Agriculture is performing for an audience of one. He's demonstrating to Trump and to Trump's legal team that the conservative majority is willing to go as far as they need to go to deliver the authoritarian government Trump desires, and the attorney's halting response about not having greater certainty than I have about the full gamut of statutory authorities is him trying to preserve some shred of limiting principle, trying to suggest maybe we shouldn't hand the president the power to fire everyone in every agency, but all 6 of the Supreme Court's conservative justices indicated during oral arguments that a president should have absolute control over the leadership of any government body carrying out executive functions, such as rulemaking and law enforcement, pointing to Article 2's vesting of executive power in the president, which is an interpretation so sweeping and so ahistorical that it would have shocked James Madison into an early grave if he could have witnessed it. The case could transform the federal government and effectively end the independence of some 24 bipartisan agencies that Congress had designed to be insulated from political interference and direct White House supervision, and I need you to really sit with that for a moment, really contemplate what it means for the Federal Communications Commission, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the National Labor Relations Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Reserve Board, and the Merit Systems Protection Board, every other independent agency to suddenly be subject to at-will presidential control. What it means for the people tasked with regulating Wall Street and protecting workers and ensuring consumer products don't kill your children to serve at the pleasure of whoever holds the presidency and to be fireable the instant their decisions displease the White House politically. And if you think this is hyperbole or alarmism, then you haven't been paying attention because since January, Trump has also removed Democratic members from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. The Supreme Court on Monday seemed likely to expand presidential control over independent federal agencies, signaling support for President Donald Trump's firing of board members. The connection to Schedule F cannot be overstated because these are mutually reinforcing mechanisms of authoritarian control, and just yesterday Trump reinstated Schedule F through executive order, which would have stripped protections from civil servants perceived as disloyal to the president, and encouraged expressions of allegiance to the president when hiring, creating a new employment category based on statutory language exempting positions of a confidential, policy-determining, policy-making, or policy-advocating character from employment protections, and experts have put the possible numbers affected in the tens or hundreds of thousands, with the Trump official credited with the idea estimating it could apply to as many as 50,000 federal workers, except the new version called Schedule Policy/Career is even worse, giving the administration far more discretion to reclassify workers beyond the 100,000 or more that the 2020 Schedule F policy would have impacted, which means Trump wants the ability to fire not just independent agency heads, but potentially hundreds of thousands of career civil servants, creating a federal workforce that exists in a permanent state of terror, where your job security depends not on competence or expertise, but on demonstrated loyalty to whatever the president's current political agenda happens to be. The Trump administration's overall political project conforms to the general model of executive aggrandizement, seeking an extreme form of presidential concentration of power within the executive branch by weakening accountability institutions and regulations, tightening presidential control over independent agencies and the executive bureaucracy, decreasing political independence of the civil service and purging perceived opponents, and comparative political scientists who study democratic backsliding globally have been absolutely explicit that in some countries executive aggrandizement has gone so far as to move the country fully away from democracy, while in others it is relatively limited, hurting democratic norms and institutions but not debilitating the democratic system overall. And the terrifying question is which path America is on, whether our institutions are resilient enough to resist this assault, or whether we're about to discover that institutional norms and precedents and traditions only matter when people in power choose to respect them. And here's where I need to absolutely hammer this point home, because it connects everything we've been discussing to the material reality of people's lives. By being shielded from the threat of removal, independent commissioners can make policies that might conflict with those of the White House, but that are more consistent with those of Congress, which means independent agencies are governed by multi-member commissions who are removable only for cause, and the multi-member structure serves deliberative values where decisions are less likely to amplify short-term political views when groups comprised of different viewpoints must make decisions, and the bipartisan multi-member mix promotes long-term stability and helps insulate agencies from interest group capture. So what Trump and Alito and the conservative legal movement are trying to destroy isn't some abstract bureaucratic independence. They're trying to destroy the structural mechanisms that prevent regulatory agencies from being captured by the very industries they're supposed to regulate, that prevent the EPA from becoming a wholly owned subsidiary of fossil fuel companies, and prevent the NLRB from serving the interests of union-busting corporations, and prevent the FTC from letting Amazon and Facebook and Google run roughshod over antitrust law. The stakes become even clearer when you understand that Trump's Schedule F executive order, if fully implemented, will greatly expand the president's influence and weaken transparency and accountability safeguards, allowing the president to remove or replace thousands of career civil servants with loyalists that may not have the expertise or experience to effectively perform their roles. Replacing qualified nonpartisan experts with loyalists risks the well-being of every American by potentially diminishing the quality or availability of vital services and goods provided by the federal government, which is putting it mildly because what we're actually talking about is the end of expertise as a relevant qualification for government service, the replacement of people who spent their careers studying environmental science or labor law or financial regulation or public health with political operatives whose primary qualification is ideological alignment with Trump, and anyone who thinks this is fine because we need to drain the swamp, or whatever has been sold a catastrophic lie because Schedule F will enable Trump to put loyalists into place, chosen on the basis of loyalty, not competence within specific policy domains, and given that the position of the Trump administration towards much of the administrative state is dismantling it, this means putting people into place whose objectives fundamentally fly in the face of the mission orientation of those agencies. And just to drive home how immediate and concrete this threat is, how this isn't some future hypothetical but rather something happening right now as we speak, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been hamstrung by DOJ's attempts to cut nearly 90% of its workforce, and a federal court found in March that Trump administration officials were in fact engaged in an unlawful effort to dismantle and eliminate the CFPB. The agency created by Congress after the 2008 financial crisis, specifically to supervise unscrupulous lending and protect consumers from predatory financial practices, and they're trying to destroy it. They're trying to eliminate the institutional capacity of the federal government to protect ordinary people from being victimized by Wall Street. Trump's drive to dismantle U.S. agencies is seen as an existential threat to democracy and the rule of law, and not just a traditional political contest between Democrats and Republicans. So when you watch that clip of Alito running through the cabinet departments and asking whether they could all be headed by multi-member commissions insulated from presidential removal, what you're watching is a Supreme Court justice who helped invent the unitary executive theory 40 years ago, testing how far he can push that theory, how completely he can dismantle the administrative state, how much power he can concentrate in the presidency, and the answer appears to be that there are no limits whatsoever, that 5 conservative justices aren't prepared to override in service of their ideological project. Chief Justice John Roberts has led the Supreme Court's conservative majority on a steady march of increasing the power of the presidency, starting well before Donald Trump's time in the White House, and the justices could take the next step in a case being argued Monday that calls for a unanimous 90-year-old decision limiting executive authority to be overturned, with liberal Justice Elena Kagan noting the conservatives seem to be raring to take that action. Since 2010, under Roberts' leadership, the Supreme Court has steadily whittled away at laws restricting the president's ability to fire people, with Roberts writing in 2020 that the president's removal power is the rule, not the exception, and in the 2024 immunity decision, Roberts included the power to fire among the president's conclusive and preclusive powers that Congress lacks authority to restrict. The thing that should absolutely terrify anyone who cares about democratic governance is that this Supreme Court is not hiding what it's doing. It's not pretending to be engaged in neutral legal interpretation. The court's conservative majority suggested it would overturn the unanimous 90-year-old decision that has limited when presidents can fire agencies' board members or leave it with only its shell intact, with Chief Justice John Roberts referring to Humphrey's executor as a dry husk, and meanwhile liberal justices warned that the decision sought by the administration would concentrate vast power in the president's hands, robbing the agencies of expertise, but the conservatives don't care. They have a 6-justice majority, and they're going to use it to reshape the constitutional order in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. And connecting this to the broader authoritarian project, We need to be absolutely clear that Project 2025 proposed using the unitary executive theory to justify giving Trump or another president maximum control over the executive branch, and the Trump 2024 campaign platform included an expansion of executive power grounded in this theory, which means this isn't some accidental convergence of legal theories and political opportunities. This is a deliberate, coordinated effort by the conservative legal movement and the Trump campaign to use the Supreme Court as an instrument for transforming America from a system of separated powers and checks and balances into something much closer to presidential authoritarianism. And the most horrifying part is that they're not even trying to hide it anymore. They're explicit about wanting to dismantle the administrative state, explicit about viewing independent agencies as unconstitutional obstacles to presidential power, explicit about their intention to concentrate authority in the executive branch and eliminate meaningful oversight. So what do we do about this civilizational emergency unfolding before our eyes? We organize, we mobilize, we litigate, we educate, we build power in state and local governments, we support the unions representing federal workers who are preparing legal challenges, we amplify the voices of career civil servants who are being targeted by this administration, we demand that Democratic elected officials treat this with the urgency it deserves rather than performing normalcy while democratic institutions burn around us, and we absolutely must connect these dots for people who don't follow Supreme Court jurisprudence because Justice Kagan zeroed in on the impacts of overturning Humphrey's executor, raising the prospect that such a ruling could be used to target protections for officials across the government, noting that employees are wielding executive power all over the place, and yet we've had civil service laws giving them substantial protection from removal for over a century, so we're talking about demolishing more than a century of civil service protection, returning to the spoils system where every government job is a political appointment subject to partisan purges every time the presidency changes hands. The clip you just watched is Samuel Alito rehearsing autocracy, practicing the legal reasoning he'll use to hand Trump the keys to authoritarian government, testing out how to frame the destruction of independent agencies as though it's required by constitutional structure, rather than being a radical departure from constitutional tradition. And Justice Samuel Alito suggested that the earlier Supreme Court had egregiously erred, opening the door for Congress to circumvent the president if it wanted to, asking whether every cabinet office be headed by a multi-member commission, whose members are not subject to at-will removal by the president, which is such a transparently bad faith hypothetical, because Congress hasn't tried to convert cabinet departments into independent agencies. Congress has created independent agencies for specific regulatory functions where independence from political pressure serves important public purposes, but Alito needs to construct this straw man to justify his predetermined conclusion that presidential removal power must be unlimited and uncheckable. And the final bombshell I need you to internalize, the piece of this that makes everything else even more urgent and terrifying, is that next month, the justices are going to hear arguments in President Trump's decision to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, and the Solicitor General said the Fed is different, that the president is seeking to fire Cook essentially for cause based on allegations of mortgage fraud, though Cook has hotly disputed those allegations. Which means even the Federal Reserve, the institution that manages monetary policy, and whose independence from political control has been considered sacrosanct because politicizing interest rate decisions would be economically catastrophic, even the Fed is now potentially subject to presidential political control if Trump gets his way, and the conservative justices go along with it, and the justices have seemed wary about the economic uncertainty that might result if Trump can fire the leaders of the central bank. But that wariness might not be enough to save Cook's position or to preserve Fed independence if the logic of absolute presidential removal power is allowed to run its course. This is the moment, this is the inflection point where American democracy either mobilizes sufficient resistance to stop this authoritarian transformation, or we cross a threshold from which recovery becomes exponentially more difficult. Because once Trump has the power to fire anyone in the federal government who displeases him politically, once agencies are staffed entirely by loyalists rather than by experts, once the independent regulatory apparatus is dismantled and handed to presidential control, the damage becomes structural and potentially irreversible, and future administrations will find it politically difficult to rebuild these institutions, because the conservative legal movement will have secured Supreme Court precedents declaring that independent agencies are unconstitutional usurpations of presidential power. So watch that clip again. Listen to Alito's casual bureaucratic sadism as he lists the agencies Trump wants to control. Understand that this is the sound of democracy dying by judicial fiat, and then get angry enough to fight back before it's too late.